Hari Om. Can we feel any difference between the worldly pleasures and the happiness we get out of turning within? It is our very nature, the very nature of all the human beings to seek happiness and to avoid misery or suffering. All of us love oneself the most because of the fact that we derive maximum happiness from oneself, from one's beingness. And all of us experience the pure happiness while we are in the state of deep sleep, wherein we remain without being conscious of a body or the mind. So, to experience such happiness, we need to know oneself. And the ultimate way and the most direct way to know oneself is the practice of Mahayoga, as taught by Bhagavan Sri Ramana Maharshi. So now, let us see the details regarding how we derive happiness or the pleasures from worldly objects, and how we derive happiness when we turn our attention within. Essentially, the source of all the happiness is Bhagavan, the Nirguna Brahman, Atma, Aham, I am, the Supreme Being, Sachidananda, existence, consciousness, bliss, God. So, all the happiness, the source is Supreme Being. When that happiness is experienced through worldly objects, say people, places, or things, worldly objects, then it is called as the worldly pleasure. Here we use two different words, pleasure and happiness. Pleasure basically denotes the happiness we derive out of the worldly objects, places, or people. So, likewise, we use the word happiness, Ananda, when we refer to the joy we derive out by turning within from oneself. The joy which emanates from oneself, the state of being, is called as the happiness in general. And the joy we derive out of the worldly objects, things, people, or the places, is referred to as the worldly pleasures. The major difference being worldly pleasures generally are of short duration. They change quickly. Generally, we experience pleasures and pain often changing from one to the other. So, it is always changing. It is for a limited time period. And even though one may be experiencing the same pleasure for longer duration, the intensity or the degree of that pleasure goes down in due course of time. When we get something we want in the worldly sense, say a big mansion or a huge amount of wealth, wonderful house, a good family, lot of worldly comforts. So all these things, they tend to give us a good source of joy in the beginning, but in due course of time we get accustomed to them, and then our mind again seeks something different to derive that same level of pleasure. And we can also see that the happiness or the inherent bliss which all of us experience while we are in the state of deep sleep, it is common across everyone, from a beggar who is sleeping on the street to a wealthy person who is sleeping in a mansion. So it is not really dependent upon our wealth or such things. So, how much ever one may acquire in the worldly sense, ultimately one will still feel incomplete in terms of enjoyment or the happiness one gets out of those things. So, how exactly we derive worldly happiness, worldly pleasures? As I said earlier, the source is the same, one's beingness, the aham. So, the happiness we get out of the worldly objects is basically something we think so. It is not really obtained from the worldly objects, because only a conscious being can be able to emanate happiness, and worldly objects being inert, they cannot really give us any pleasures. So it is something we think so. We believe we are deriving happiness from those worldly objects. But in reality, the truth is that we have certain desires or wishes. So we go about and we try to fulfill those wishes or desires. We may face some hurdles on the way, but yet we strive hard to fulfill those desires, and in due course of time we get some opportunities, avenues by which we will be able to fulfill those desires or wishes. So when such a desire or wishes are getting fulfilled, what happens is that for a brief period of time our mind subsides into its source. For a brief moment of time, after the fulfillment of a particular wish or a desire, we feel kind of joyful, and since we could experience that wish or a desire until the next desire arises, our mind merges back and subsides into its source, which is the aham or the pure I or the presence of Bhagavan. And then that happiness we experience for that period of time. So essentially, no worldly objects can give us happiness or pleasure. Whatever we feel that we are getting from the worldly objects, which makes us happy, or really the happiness we get from our own being when the mind sinks into its source of pure I or the presence of Bhagavan. So one can in fact derive the same happiness only if one can practice the path of Mahayoga. Say for example, now I have a desire to go to a movie. Now I can make plans and then go to a movie and then watch the movie and then have my desire fulfilled, because of which for a brief moment my mind will go back to the source, thereby I will experience that kind of happiness or a pleasure. Now when the thought about going to a movie or a wish about going to a movie first happened in my mind, at that point of time itself, if I could do the practice of vichara, wherein I immediately shift my attention to that source of that thought and then turn my attention back towards the I thought, thereby the I thought will subside back into its source of pure I and then merge with the pure I for a time being, thereby I will experience the happiness of being aham or the pure I. Now instead of this, I go about the desire or the wish, I join myself with the desire and then I make elaborate plans and then efforts to go to that particular movie, and then I go and watch that movie, get my desire fulfilled, and then I find that for a brief period my mind sinks back into a source the source of the pure eye, whereby I experience some happiness. And I would wrongly associate that happiness that I experienced after watching that movie to the particular act of going and watching that movie. So I would think that it is because of the fact that I watched that particular movie, I am feeling happy. But the truth is that it is not that watching of that movie, that event itself is giving me any happiness. The happiness is basically due to the fulfillment of the desire or a wish. And when the desire or the wish gets fulfilled, my mind sinks back to the source of pure eye and experiences the happiness of being merged with the pure eye for a time being. So instead of watching that movie, had I inquired within, had I shifted my attention towards the source, whereby the I thought would merge back into its source of the pure eye, I could have experienced the same happiness at that point in time itself. And after that, even that particular desire or wish also would not have happened again, because to the extent we don't react to a thought and we go back to the source with the practice of Mahayoga, to that extent those thoughts will not reappear again. So that way I could have experienced the same happiness at that moment itself, instead of going over and making all these efforts to fulfill that particular desire. And also I could have kind of become free from experiencing the same thought over again. So this is the way by which a wise person would choose to go about deriving happiness in one's life, not pursuing unwanted worldly objects or things or events. Thereby one experience the happiness from only from within and not due to the particular worldly object. So wise people will understand this truth, and then naturally they will reflect upon the truth, thereby start practicing the path of Mahayoga, so that one will able to experience the joy which emanates from oneself just by shifting the attention as and when any unwanted desires or thoughts arise, so that rather than fulfilling those thoughts and then experience the happiness of our own beingness or the presence of Bhagavan, one would rather choose to shift the attention back to the presence of Bhagavan or the pure eye, thereby experiencing the joy from within in that same time, and also avoid future recurrence of those kind of thoughts. So essentially, the way in which we experience the happiness of the worldly objects or from turning within, though appear to be in different ways, the source of that happiness remains the same, being the presence of Bhagavan or the pure eye. And the difference being that the worldly pleasures are for a limited time, and after that it will go away, and hence we constantly seek out pleasures through different worldly objects again and again and again. Whereas the happiness we derive out of turning within, even though it can also be for a period of time in the beginning, but later on with the practice of Mahayoga, gradually the period of time wherein one remains in that happiness will increase, and in due course of time with the consistent practice of Mahayoga, happily and with so much of earnestness, one would be able to experience that kind of undecaying happiness of being in the source of the mind, whereby the mind remains merged with the pure eye or the presence of Bhagavan, and yet one can be engaged in the worldly activities, the normal routine worldly life, and to do one's duties in the world without getting impacted by the worldly issues, and yet also experiencing the inherent happiness which constantly emanate from within the presence of Bhagavan or the pure eye. So the difference lies in its nature. The worldly pleasures are limited time, they endure for a short time, and after that the pressure and pain alternates, and also we wrongly associate the source of the pressure to be some worldly objects, and it will make us entangled in the worldly things more and more. It will increase our vasanas, it will create further samskaras. So the kind of binding with the worldly objects will increase. Whereas the more one turns within, the bindings with the worldly objects and the vasanas would rather decrease in due course of time with the practice of Mahayoga, and one will have the joy or the inherent happiness for longer periods of time with the practice of Mahayoga, which will be kind of undecaying. So the difference is the nature and the way in which it is being experienced, and also the fact that one is for a brief period, whereas the second one of turning within gives us a kind of lasting peace and happiness, and in due course of time it kind of gives us freedom from the bondage. The true happiness is basically to be free from any bondage, and the practice of Mahayoga or Vichara essentially goes in that direction. When we turn within, we are going in that direction of getting released from any kinds of bondage, whereas getting the pressures out of the worldly objects is basically going to increase that bondage. So in due course of time one will not really feel much happier, rather there will be more issues and suffering in our life when we keep on seeking out the worldly pleasures, because ultimately they create further bondage and create more vasanas, desires and wishes. Thereby the cycle of birth and death will be going on and on and on. Whereas by turning within, one would go beyond that cycle, and thereafter one will remain in the state of natural undecaying happiness and peace. So such happiness is there within us always, all the time, here and now. Only we need to turn our attention within, because worldly pleasures, there is no end to it, and no amount of objects of the world which can give us pleasure for a brief period can give us that kind of lasting happiness. Even one is able to rule the entire world, still one will feel incomplete after a period of time. We will get bored out of it, we will seek something else. This is the truth. So let us understand this true nature of worldly pleasures, understand the fact that the source of the worldly pleasure is basically the presence of Bhagavan or the pure I, Atma, and hence let us avoid seeking out worldly pleasures by this deep understanding of the fact that there is really no such thing as a worldly pleasure, because no inert object can give us happiness. It is impossible. And the happiness we get out of the objects, worldly objects, is because of the fact that it fulfills our desire, thereby mind sinks back into its source of pure being, the presence of Bhagavan or the pure I. So with that understanding, let us happily turn within and remain in the source of pure I, whereby one will gradually experience more and more peace and happiness, which will be undecaying and lasting. Arunachala Shiva, Arunachala Shiva, Arunachala Shiva.